I'm John Mackenzie. Coming up on Football Today.
Soldiers on the streets of Santiago for the first time since the end of the military dictatorship.
Estoy convencido que la democracia.
I am convinced that democracy not only has the right, but has the obligation to defend itself using all the instruments that democracy provides, and the rule of law.
Que quieren destruirla.
Protests began after a rise in ticket prices for the capital's metro, but anger has widened amid the huge inequality between the rich and poor.
We've just had confirmation that after 5 hours of meeting between officials from Flamengo and River Plate, the final of the Copa Libertadores will be played in Lima, in the Monumental Stadium.
For the past month, Chile has been gripped by protests against the incumbent government. With hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets, everyday life in the country is in turmoil. In this episode, we ask, why is there no football being played in Chile right now?
My initial feeling was, at last something is being done, because it just felt like the situation couldn't go on. Too many people were struggling day to day here.
Adam Brandon is a South American football writer who lives in Santiago.
The situation had been deteriorating over a number of years, and it just always felt it kind of just needed a spark maybe for some huge social movement like this to happen.
What was the underlying political context behind these protests?
In 2017, in his speech returning to presidency, Sebastián Piñera, who had a term a few years ago as president of Chile, he came back basically promising the nation better times were ahead for the country. But between then and the protests starting, the economy had slowed, services were becoming increasingly overstretched, and there was a huge police scandal involving a cover-up of the death of an innocent Mapuche man in the south of the country at the hands of the police. Mapuche is the indigenous people of Chile. The police had basically initially claimed that they had acted in self-defense, but then a video emerged showing that this Mapuche man was completely helpless in the situation.
But there's also an economic driver behind this unrest too, right?
In my experience of living here for a decade, I personally just see a very unequal society. The way I describe Chile to many people in terms of living costs is that the wages are comparable to many other places in Latin America, but the costs of goods and services are similar to places in Europe. It always felt to me like Chile was a society that would just say, at some point, we can't take any more of this.
In October, things reached a breaking point.
What actually kicked off the movement was a 30 peso increase on the metro system.
Students started the action 11 days ago, angry about a 4% increase in ticket prices.
Now, on the face of it, that doesn't sound like much. It's just a few cents or pennies for our American and British listeners. But it was part of a series of public transport fare increases over the years, which made Santiago one of the most expensive metro networks in Latin America. I actually read one statistic that said in 12 years the fare had increased almost 100%, while the minimum wage in that time, hadn't moved in relation to that.
Let's talk about the protests in particular. They began primarily as student action against the metro price rise, and they involved students jumping over barriers, holding gates open so that people didn't have to pay the hike. How did things escalate from there?
I can only go by what I personally saw. What I witnessed was the police going into metro stations where these protests were being held, and I can only describe the actions of the police who dealt with the situation in those metro stations as heavy-handed. There was quite a lot of vandalism already taking place in the metro station, so the students were mostly protesting peacefully, but they had caused some damage, so the workers in the metro station did start to feel intimidated and afraid, and that's why the police were called in. But just how the police went about it only served to kind of escalate the situation. Tear gas canisters were let off in these enclosed spaces, and some protesters and even a completely innocent bystander got shot in the chaos. When these pictures of the students being attacked by the police went viral, it just set off a massive reaction, which saw the movement going from a few hundred students in the metro stations in Santiago to thousands, and then eventually even hundreds of thousands over that weekend across the country protesting.
Defiance in the capital, Santiago. Hundreds of thousands of Chileans are protesting as security forces use tear gas to disperse them.
Mostly peacefully, but there was definitely a lot of groups going around setting out to cause a huge amount of damage. There was also a considerable amount of looting going on.
But then the government retract the price rise and nothing happens.
At that point, Piñera starts to try and make some other changes. Electricity prices were also frozen, and he announced other changes, like he did raise pensions and minimum wages, but nowhere near enough to the point the protesters were actually demanding.
A state of emergency has been imposed in several cities across Chile after 7 people died amid violent clashes and arson attacks over the weekend. Tear gas and water cannons were used against demonstrators as police and military forces announced a nighttime curfew to try and restore order.
By the end of the weekend, the president had called the army out onto the streets for the first time in almost 3 decades, and a curfew was also put in place. We all had to be inside our homes by 6 o'clock in the evening, I think it was, which is incredibly early. You know, it's still light at that time in Santiago. So that was a new experience for me and pretty much all Chileans sort of under the age of 30. Piñera also blundered that weekend by saying that the country was at war.
We are at war against a powerful, implacable enemy who does not respect anything or anyone, and who is willing to use violence and crime without any limits.
Even the army general dismissed such language the next day, and I think at that point Piñera's position weakened even further in the eyes of the public.
It's now a month since these protests began. Where are things at in Chile right now?
It does feel like there is a huge chasm really between what the general public feel the situation is like and how the president sees it. I get the impression that he thinks that this will just suddenly blow over someday soon. But personally, I think he's in for a big shock, and there could still be huge protests still to come.
So where does football fit into all of this?
Professional football is probably the industry which seems to have suffered the most, just in terms of it hasn't functioned at all since the start of this movement. It's the only industry in the country, as far as I'm aware, that has completely stopped its main function for the past month in terms of no professional matches played. There have been training sessions and friendly matches behind closed doors, but very little competitive action. I think 1 or 2 professional matches did get played before they had to cancel it all again last week.
La Copa Libertadores, que enfrenta River Plate y Flamengo, se jugará en el Monumental de Lima.
As well as that, CONMEBOL, South America's football federation, they had chosen Santiago as host city for the 2019 Copa Libertadores final set to take place this coming Saturday, November 23rd. After the chaos of River and Boca last year, I think they went for Santiago as kind of the safe choice, with Chile's reputation for stability in the region. That has obviously backfired massively on them, and they did and ah along with the Chilean government about moving it, but finally they did come to what I believe is a correct decision to move it from Santiago. That game will now take place in Lima. They had to move it because I think the protesters would have specifically targeted that event to gain an international audience, if you will. The other major thing which has happened is Chile's national team. They cancelled a home friendly with Bolivia. Bolivia, another country in the region going through huge upheaval at the moment.
Bolivian President Evo Morales has resigned. Morales announced he was stepping down Sunday afternoon after the military asked him to leave office.
They haven't played football there for a month either. And an away fixture in Lima against Peru was cancelled after the Chile players got together at their camp in Santiago and held a meeting to discuss the situation and whether or not they should play. Gary Medel, the current captain of the national team, posted a statement on his Instagram basically saying that the most important match at the moment is the one the general public is playing and fighting for, and that is more justice in Chilean society. Last week, the women's national team, they did play in Australia. Just over half the squad took part in a protest after the match, holding up signs telling the world of the crimes committed by the state since this uprising began.
So what's the situation now for football fans? What is the near future going to hold for them?
What maybe might surprise some of our listeners is actually, the majority of football fans here in Chile on the whole, about 70% or more in most polls I've seen, don't want any football to return at all till the situation in the country is resolved to an acceptable point. Now, that acceptable point will be different for different people. The season is set to resume this coming weekend, and a lot of the players who were against football coming back and were saying that they're with the people, they don't want to play football until the situation resolved. It does seem that they've been convinced to try and play this weekend. Now, whether or not the powerful barras here, the big fan groups who traditionally sit behind one of the goals, whether or not they will be allowing the matches to take place is a different matter. I've got a feeling they're going to try and stop people going to the stadium, perhaps. If the matches don't go ahead this weekend, I think the Chilean FA are basically going to be forced to play the rest of the season behind closed doors, perhaps. There's even been talk of moving some matches to Argentina, but I think that would only be done in very extreme circumstances to finish the season off. For now, it seems like a majority of people here in Chile don't particularly care much about football at the moment. It's a situation which is still developing, and it's going to be interesting to see how the general public react next week to football possibly returning.
Coming up after the break, we take a look at the game in which one team didn't show up and trace the history of Chile's present back into its past. If you like football content with a great blend of knowledge and humour, look no further than the Beautiful Game podcast. It's a podcast that doesn't just focus on football results, they have entertaining topical debates and look to address social issues like discrimination and inequality, plus much more. They have gained great respect in the football fraternity with their polished views and the esteemed guests that they have welcomed onto their show. Darren Lewis, Kevin Lisby, Rob Harris, Miguel Delaney, and West Ham United women's footballer Julia Simic are just a few of the people who have featured on their podcast. If you're looking to be educated whilst also having a laugh, look no further than the Beautiful Game podcast. It will be easy to suppose that these upheavals in Chile are simply a part of the country's recent history, but it is impossible to understand Chile's present without looking at Chile's past.
Probably the most famous story combining football and politics here in Chile happened during qualifying for the 1974 World Cup.
Dateline 1973, Chile. The world's only freely elected Marxist president is overthrown by military coup.
Pinochet and the army ousted Allende, the president of Chile at the time, a socialist. He was democratically elected into that position, but with help from the CIA, basically a military coup was achieved. What then happened was the army gathered up many left-wing activists, artists, and they took them to detention camps. And one of the detention camps was the Estadio Nacional, which is in the middle of Santiago. People there were tortured and even murdered.
More or less, everybody who was detained was the victim of some sort of violence. Some more than others. Some with electricity, others with brutal beatings. Others were shot somewhere within the sports complex itself.
Whilst this was going on in the chambers of the stadium, Chile were actually forced to play a World Cup qualifying match against the Soviet Union. The first leg had finished 0-0 in Russia. Chilean players who went to that, they had a very arduous journey there and back. And when they got back to Chile, they had already realised that the Soviets were never actually going to turn up for the second leg in Santiago, due to the fact, whilst Chile had a socialist president, the relations between Chile and the Soviet Union were on good terms. But obviously, once the military coup happened, the Soviet Union cut all ties with Chile. So that included not turning up for this second leg. Chile kicked off and scored a goal into an empty net, and then the final whistle went. Chile qualified for the World Cup, but obviously in quite dark circumstances.
So how would you say that the footballers in Chile have engaged with the government during those years of both of the dictatorship and then following? Were there critical voices? Were there any players who were particularly supportive of the regime? Is there a tendency to avoid any discussion of politics at all?
During the Pinochet era, it was very dangerous for a couple of the Chile players who were kind of openly socialist. Legendary Chilean Colo-Colo striker Carlos Coselli. He was very outspoken during the dictatorship, and his mother actually suffered abuse at the hands of the Pinochet regime. A few years later, Coselli, when he scored a goal in the Estadio Nacional, did a celebration to remember those who had been murdered and tortured in that stadium. Another player, Leonardo Veliz, he was somebody who decided that he was so scared after the military coup happened, he basically stayed home for 3 days, too scared to go out of his house. And this was just a few days, as I mentioned before, Chile had to travel to the Soviet Union for a World Cup qualifier for that first leg. He only went out of his house when somebody from Chile's national team staff came to his apartment with a bag and ID to show that he was a player for the Chile national team and he was going to represent Chile abroad. So there have certainly been critical voices in the past. Also, currently, there has been critical voices during this current movement. In the past few weeks, former Wigan and Birmingham winger Jean Bossellur, he springs to mind as somebody with Mapuche roots that has promoted their fight over the years, but he's also spoken eloquently in the past few weeks about this protest. He seemed fully behind the protesters, as was Bayer Leverkusen midfielder Charles Aranguiz. He's been very vocal, in fact, during this whole movement as being on the side of the protesters and encouraging them to protest more. He says that, if he was in Chile, that he would be on the front line with them. The two most famous footballers Chile have produced are Alexis Sanchez and Arturo Vidal. Now, they've come in for quite a lot of criticism from the general public since the start of this protest for a bit too much fence sitting. One other name possibly worth mentioning here is Jorge Valdivia, who was a very vocal supporter of Piñera during the last election and wrote on Twitter in support of a lot of the right-wing policies that Piñera was promoting at the time. He's somebody who has also come in for quite a lot of criticism since this movement started for being on the other side of it all.
So how has the Pinochet regime continued to impact Chile in the present day?
The biggest long-term effect of the Pinochet regime upon Chile was probably the changes made to the welfare state in his tenure. From about 1920, the welfare state in Chile had slowly but surely improved living standards, especially among the lower income classes of the population. When the 1973 military coup happened, there were fundamental reforms after that. And basically, Chile switched from being a welfare state, which was very socially orientated programs of development, to ones which were dictated by market and economics.
Chile is by all odds the best success story in Latin America today. Chile was a case in which a military regime was willing to switch the organization of the economy from a top-down to a bottom-up performance.
That has had a huge impact, which I still think has lasted until today, because there's no effective welfare state in place to support people. The state of the minimum wage, the pension system, the health system, these can all be traced back to the decisions made during the dictatorship.
Have these widening inequalities impacted football-going fans in the present day, do you think?
The most popular team, the team of the people, as they're often referred to here, Colo Colo, their fans will always say that they feel they're being priced out of football a lot of the time, and that's one of the reasons they don't fill their stadium each week. The other big side here, Universidad de Chile, they quite often do fill their stadium, but they do it via special offers, 2-for-1 deals and that kind of thing. But generally, attendances throughout Chile are very low. I think one of the reasons for that is, people just don't have that much disposable income to spend on going to football matches. All the top division matches here you can watch on cable TV, equivalent of maybe about $15 a month, I think it would be. And a ticket here costs similar to that for a lot of the matches. So I think a lot of people just choose to watch it on cable TV at home rather than go to the stadium because it's cheaper that way. I would say probably a majority of football fans don't even have cable TV. They tend to just watch the Chile national team because their games are still live on state television.
One of the most important moments in Chile's history was the formation of a constitution that appeared in 1980. This constitution enshrines a lot of those ideas that we've talked about, this free market ideology.
Many of the demands have been in the political agenda for decades and have not been transformed into public policy. And that's why I think a constituent assembly could be a way to overcome this problem and to create a new legitimacy, a new political legitimacy that articulates these demands.
This constitution is now back in the news because it's almost seen as a rallying point for the protesters. They see that constitution as holding the key to a lot of the problematic ideas that the state now uphold. One of the bargaining chips they're using is a rewrite of this constitution. And Piñera himself has actually offered, I believe, another referendum in some sense on this constitution in order to deflate the tensions. How do you see all of this going? Will that be something that comes to pass?
I think it's very difficult to tell at this point if it will deflate the tensions enough or not. It does appear to have satisfied a few on the edges of the protests, and that includes the players and the presidents at football clubs, for example. They see that offering of a new constitution as sort of the olive branch. Can we now get back to playing football? Let's see how this goes, kind of thing. But I think at the heart of the protest movement is largely unmoved by a lot of these offerings from Piñera. Even though the constitution is something they demanded, the issue is that until he addresses the inequalities in society, I don't think the protesters will quite believe him. But the other thing that we need to add into the mix is the human rights abuses. The army, when they were on the streets for a week, and also the police over the course of the last month have committed against some of the protesters. That has added another ingredient into an already quite potent mix. That is going to be one of the drivers for protesters to protest for many months to come.
It sounds like you have quite a pessimistic view then of the possibility of a new constitution.
It's more just how politics are in general in the world at the moment. It's quite difficult, isn't it, to be optimistic. I do have some hope that these protests will have a positive impact, but being realistic and seeing how these kind of things have gone in the past, I fear that it may end up in a negative, but let's hope not.
So the future of football in Chile then, how do you feel about that?
The whole movement has made people sit up and take notice, and I think has made people in a lot of industries review what they could be doing better in their field. I believe Chilean football is no different to that there, and we have seen improvements, especially on the women's side of the game here in the last couple of years, and their league becoming better and more professional. So yeah, I am hopeful that the protests will bring about a new Chile, a fairer and more just Chile, and then hopefully that will also impact positively on the football here in the future. But like I say, overall, it is difficult at times to maintain an optimistic outlook.
Kevin Brandon is a South American football writer. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoyed this episode, why not rate and review on iTunes or share it with a friend? See you next time.